Hi again then guys, and welcome to the 52nd episode of Weekend Warriors, the review series for GranTurismo's sports car lineup. And in this particular pick, we're talking about a car which, at least from what I've seen, doesn't get that much love. That being said, however, I am actually a huge fan of this vehicle. In fact, this generation of the Mercedes SL, the R129 series, is actually my favourite SL shape of them all, classic or modern. I don't know why it's my favourite, I just love the chunky, angular, edgy styling, and to me it just looks classy. Of course it's dated, but to me at least it still looks just as good now as it did when it was released. Now of course that's down to personal preference, but the real question that's important in the scheme of racing in particular, but also just ownership in general on GranTurismo, is what does it offer for its respective price? Because when you're talking cars like Mercedes models, Jaguars, Aston Martins, those kind of vehicles, you're looking at big prices. They're very expensive on GranTurismo, and they pretty much always have been. This is no exception. This is a very, very expensive car, because the price tag is 210,000 credits, and that frankly is way too high for this vehicle. That is supercar money for what is at the end of the day just a really good sports car, in real life anyway. On the game, well, we'll talk about whether or not it's good in a second, but 210 grand either way is a lot of cash. It's not a premium, it doesn't have the kind of racing potential that something with potentially a much lower price like a Nissan GTR or a Dodge Viper might have, but by that measure there are many sports cars which wouldn't necessarily turn out that well. That's the problem with comparing them to cars which are essentially the best in their class. So if you step back from the best or nothing logic and just view the car from its own way, and first of all, is it a good car, and then move on to does it have the competitive ability to take on other cars, because you can have a vehicle which may not win races but you might still want to buy it because it's just a nice car. I would say that there are definitely vehicles for me like that on GranTurismo. Stuff like the Nissan Pao, the Prince Skyline, the Jay Leno tank car, different vehicles for different people. Now when it comes to spec on this particular vehicle, it's running some good numbers, especially given what it's got to work with. Now Mercedes models are known for having a lot of power and usually a lot of straight line speed on GranTurismo, and this car really is no exception in that regard. It's not as quick as something like an SL600 of the R230 shape, or an SLS or an SLR, but for its age and for its class, being more of a sports car than a super sports or obviously supercar, it's good for that category. Now, of course, there are two different versions of this vehicle. There's the SL600 and the SL500. We will also be covering the SL500, but suffice it to say, compared to this vehicle, the SL500 is, for spec at least, the inferior of the two, as you'd assume. The bigger number, the better car. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the way Mercedes structures their model range, the bigger the number is, the bigger the engine. But they do make some slight differentiations sometimes between vehicles within a range that will be more focused on the performance side of things and on being, in effect, hardcore versions, but then they'll have vehicles which are very similar to those, but they'll have more of an upmarket, maybe less flashy image, which is more about having that performance but in a more classy package. That is the essential difference, really, between the SL65, for instance, and the SL600. They have similar numbers. Now, of course, with this car, there is no SL65 on the game, but it's that kind of difference. The SL500 is the V8, it's the better-known model. The SL600, though, has that big 6-litre V12. It's the flying flagship, but at the same time, because it's not a 55 or 65 AMG model, it doesn't have as flashy an appearance, just like how the SL600 isn't as flashy as the SL65 in the newer shape Mercedes SL range. So that being said, with a 6-litre V12 on board, you'd expect a lot from the car, and it gives you a lot. It's naturally aspirated. Now you've got no supercharger, no turbo to work with, so how good is it really going to be? Well, very good, actually. You're looking at 682 horsepower fully tuned, 626 pound-feet of torque, which for a naturally aspirated car is very impressive, but though there is a downside. Unsurprisingly for a Mercedes, it is heavy, and a lot of the SL models are very heavy, especially the upmarket ones like the SL600s. Even with the full weight loss package, this is a 1.5 tonne car. That's a lot heavier than many of the other cars in this series, even when you compare it to something like a CL600, which is known for being a huge coupe, but even that is around 50 kilos lighter than this is. And unfortunately, that big weight that the car is carrying around does mean that the horsepower per tonne doesn't sound that great. 453 given the power isn't really that impressive. There are cars with less power which also have far less weight, which will still be putting out better numbers than this one. But one of the advantages of having more weight is that it will typically allow the car to have a lower PP level with that same amount of power. A same amount of power that a car with less weight wouldn't be able to ever hit. That is an advantage for this model, because the fully tuned PP level, even with 682 horsepower, is only 566. That's very reasonable. And although I'm not going to claim that this is some track day monster which feels like a 900 kilo sports car, of course not, but it does handle itself remarkably well for its size and weight, in a similar way to something like a Dodge Challenger or a Chrysler 300C. They are also big, heavy cars, not quite as heavy as this, but in a similar way, they don't feel as heavy as they actually are. In terms of performance, this vehicle's no slouch. Remember, no turbo, no supercharger, so it makes it pretty useful for naturally aspirated events, especially ones which require more straight-line performance. And from that, you're looking at around or even over 250 miles per hour. Acceleration is also very good, and the handling, although as I said is not as sharp as a much lighter sports car, is surprisingly smooth. And also surprisingly beginner friendly, I have to say. Now, this vehicle is not one which will appeal to everyone, certainly not with a 210,000 credit price tag, but if you fancy trying something with big power that's a bit more classy, a bit more old school, and certainly less used, it's worth a look. You may just be surprised by how good it can be. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.